Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having an awesome day. Today we are in the truck. We are headed out to our shop to install the leveling kit on my 2009 F-150. We got Chris in front of us in his beautiful 2016 F-150. It's gonna be a good time. Let's get to it. All right, so this is what we have here. This is what came from Rough Country. On each side we have the actual block, I guess, itself. This goes on top of the strut tower that you'll see. And then as well, it comes with the bolts and everything to go through. So it kind of works like a spacer on a wheel in a way. We have the recessed units, and so it should be fairly easy. All right, so we're about to get going here. Before we actually started, the first thing we did was jacked up the truck, put some blocks underneath it, took off the wheel, and we sprayed everything down that we're gonna be loosening with a penetrating oil. We use WD-40, but anything really will work. Just because the truck is 10, 11 years old, you wanna make sure that everything is sprayed down. Just make it a little easy. So we did that, had our coffee, and now we're ready to get started. Before we begin, this way is going to be one of the easier ways to do this. There's a lot of tutorials on YouTube where you have to take the lower A-arm off, the brake caliper, the brake rotor. The way that we're gonna do it today, we're not gonna have to take any of that off, and it's still not gonna be too much of a struggle. Should be fairly simple. So the first thing that we're gonna do is these 3 bolts. So we have an 8mm, a 10mm, and a 10mm. All of those need to come off. So that's gonna be the first thing. So now that those are loose, the next thing we want to do is, some people take this off and undo the ABS sensor from down there, but all we need to do is push this out, and we can actually undo it from the top. We just have a little clip, and then that is nice and free for us. As well, we're just going to have to pry out these kind of push pin things, but then everything will be free. All right, now that that's done, the next thing we have to do is undo this. I believe it was a 21mm. You might have to put a 10mm socket or a 10mm box wrench on the end because this can spin as well. So we'll let you know if we have to or not. But that's the first thing we need to do. Take this out of that. Now that that's done, the next thing we have to do is undo the sway bar. You can undo it at the top or the bottom. We're gonna undo it at the top. We need an 18mm socket as well as I believe it's a 8mm socket for the top. Again, just in case it does spin. But as you saw, it didn't spin on the last one, so we might be good. Let's get to it. Next step here is we need to undo the upper A-arm. So this is a 21mm socket, but same thing, you'll need a 10mm box wrench on the end to hold it. I think that's it, right? All right. So as we're going through, we loosened it got really, really tight, so we tightened it back up, we sprayed it with WD-40. We're gonna clean up the threads a bit, and then we're gonna try again. Now that we got it off, we're actually gonna put the nut back on, so when we break it loose, it doesn't completely fall. The nut will catch it. But we're gonna put the nut on, we're gonna bang right here, and it should come loose pretty easily. 'Cause, 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 'cause so like we said, the nut caught it. We're good to go. Before we take that off, we're going to take this cap off and undo the nut that's underneath it. That's holding the axle in. We're actually going to have to pull it apart just to give us a little more room later on, but it's a lot easier to do this step now. So for this, you're going to need a flathead screwdriver or a little pry bar and a hammer. So once the cap's off, you'll need a 13mm socket to get the nut off. All right, the nut is off. That one is still there. Before we undo that, just because everything is still somewhat solid, we're actually going to try to take this lower strut mount bolt out. It's a big bolt that goes through, and then it has a big nut on the other side. This side, I believe, is a 27mm, and the other side is a 29mm. Like I said, just doing that before we take this apart is going to make our lives a lot easier while this is still somewhat solid together. Alright, so we have the bolts almost all the way out. Before we take it out, we're just putting a jack underneath, just so we have some support because the strut will be loose. Alright, so we're going to take that nut out now so that it can fully drop, and then we're going to take out the bottom one. Alright, so this bolt is out. While we were doing it, we had to put a block under here just to help support this so it didn't fall over. Just make sure none of your lines are tight. This one's about as tight as we want it to be, but we still have some movement there, so we're good. The next thing we need to do is take off the 3 bolts that hold in the top of the strut mount, and then the strut will be ready to come out. All 3 bolts are out, and so the strut is loose. Before we put the jack down so that we can get the lower part of the strut out of its mount, we're just gonna tie this up. We're just gonna loop it over the frame there, just so that this doesn't go anywhere, just so it's, you know, not flopping around and breaking any of these lines. More just a safety precaution. If you had something like a brake caliper hanger, you could probably use something like that, maybe tied to the A-arm, but I think this is a pretty solid option as well. All right, that's tied up. I'm gonna hold it anyways just to make sure it's good, but Chris is gonna let down the jack, and let's take the strut out. All right, now that we have the strut out, we need to start getting our spacer ready. So in the pack, for each side, you have 3 of these. You have your 3 nuts, and then you have these 2 nuts here, and I'll explain what everything is for. So these guys go into these holes, and this will be what attaches to the upper strut mount when we put it back in. But as you can see, these can just spin. And so obviously if we try to tighten them up, it's not gonna work. So what we have to do is we actually have to seat these first. So I'll show you how we do that. So on each of these bolts, we have these little ridges. When we seat these ridges are gonna push into the soft aluminum, and it's gonna hold it tight in place. It's a pretty cool system. You don't need to have a nut on the back or anything like that. It holds them in there pretty strong, so it should work well. All right, so to seat these, what we're gonna do is we're gonna put the bolt in. They say that it's a spacer and a nut, but it's really just 2 nuts. We're gonna put them onto this side. Tighten that down, and then with a 17mm socket, we are going to tighten this as much as we can. In doing so, it drives that stud into the aluminum. Then we take it off. And now this can't turn, it's in there nice and solid. And we do it for the other 3. All right, so each of the spacers, one has an A, one has a B. Make sure the A is for the driver's side, B is for the passenger side. That's gonna be very important, or else your studs will not line up. What we're gonna do right now is we are going to attach the spacer to the top of the strut tower. You're gonna use the original bolts, or the original nuts, sorry, to attach it to the strut. All right, so the instructions say each of these need to be torqued down to 30 foot-pounds of torque, so we are doing that now with our torque wrench. Good. All right. Let's take it back to the truck. All right, time to put the strut back in. We're gonna start by putting the top in and then kind of wiping the bottom into its place. The jack at the bottom is really helpful to kind of level it up and down to get it in there, but remember you have added 2 inches of height, so it is gonna be a little trickier to get it in than it was getting it out. Also, as you can see, it does say out on this. The strut actually turns 180 degrees from where it was when we took it out. But as long as you put the driver's side, the A on the driver's side, and when you're installing it, the out is to the out, you can't mess it up. So we just put the bottom strut mount bolt through. We're gonna tighten the nuts at the top. Let's do it. All right, so the strut tower is in, or the strut's in now, both at the top and the bottom. Everything's tightened up. We're basically just gonna put everything back together. Some things you wanna keep in mind. You wanna make sure that your axle is seated nicely in the whole knuckle here before you put the nut back on. You want to make sure that when you're tightening all of these up on the upper A-arm, the steering, and the sway bar, you probably will have to use those box wrenches to hold the smaller inner part. I know we didn't have to do it when we were taking them off, but you probably will when you're putting them on. And then just make sure that all the little stuff that you unbolted, you bolt up at the end, but besides that, you just kind of do everything in reverse order. So we're not going to explain it as we go, we're just going to time lapse it. So thanks for watching and enjoy. Is cleaning up here, and thank him for his help. We're just taking a look at the truck. Do make sure you get an alignment after this is done. We're going to check it ourselves and then go for an alignment later just to make sure that I can drive home and everything's good. But if you can see, I know we didn't really do a before, but this is looking a ton better. It's just wonderful. I'm so happy. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully you learned a little something today. I'll do a video later in the year letting you know how this is holding up and if we've had any issues from this part. But this is a nice, cheap mod you can do for your truck that really levels it out. Most trucks, especially in the 1500 category, your F-150, your Ram 1500, your Chevys, the fronts normally sag down a bit. And if you want it to be a little more leveled, a nice 2-inch leveling kit usually does the trick. This was only about 150 bucks Canadian, which is probably just over 100 bucks American. Super cheap, super accessible, and the job was probably like a 6 or 7 out of 10, but definitely something you could do on your own in your driveway. So thanks for tuning in, guys. We will see you in the next video. Take care. Have a great night.